Welcome to Jaguar Bootcamp, Timing Your First Race. This is Part 2, Preparing. The information in this presentation is the property of Innovative Timing Systems, LLC. All of this information is confidential, and it may not be disclosed to anyone outside of Innovative Timing Systems or your own company without written authorization from the President of Innovative Timing Systems. This presentation is only provided to customers who are under a current support agreement that has not expired. In Part 1 of this preparing module, we talked about the communication with the race director and how important it is to gather the information you're going to need to successfully time the event. We also spoke about expectations and setting those properly. Now we need to gather some additional information so that we can set up some of our defaults that we'll want to use on race day. Remember that Jaguar can be configured to do just about anything, and some of the types of information that we have to define so that we can generate reports and properly time a race include things like the age groups, divisions, and setting filters so that we don't read unwanted chips. We also have to be able to load our data. That's the race data that defines who the participants will be. All of that information can be summarized in Jaguar under our default settings, and now we're going to take a look at how do we gather that information and put it into the software. One of the first things you want to ask the race director is what type of races are they going to be having that day? In other words, are they having a 5K, perhaps a 10K, maybe a combination of the two, or a half marathon? Could be a triathlon, and if so, is it a sprint, is it Olympic, is it international distance? All those types of things need to be asked so that you fully understand the type of races that are going to be taking place. And it may be just it's one race, perhaps just a 5K, but don't just assume that. Always ask and make sure you know how many races are going that day. You're also going to want to ask about the categories. Below a race, you may have subcategories. As an example, if you're doing a triathlon, you may have Wave 1, Wave 2, Wave 3, or they may have separated people by capabilities. Maybe you have an elite category, you have an amateur, or even a pro category. In triathlons, that's quite common. So you want to understand not only the races, but the categories within those races. Now that you know how many races are taking place, one of the other questions you're going to want to ask that race director is whether or not it's a certified course. If it's a certified course, that means somebody's come out and accurately measured the course, and most of the time you'll see a little nail in the ground at the start and finish line that designate the exact locations. That's very important that you understand that, because if the race director's hired you to time the event, you want to make sure your start and finish lines are set up at the proper location. So you want to ask if it's a certified course. If it's not a certified course, you'll need to ask the race director where they want the start and finish line. So that's a very important thing to understand. Also, you're going to want to ask how long the event will take place. The duration is very important. If you're going to be there for a 12-hour event, you're going to want to charge more because you're going to have staff that's going to come and go. You'll probably have 2 shifts, possibly 1 shift, but certainly you're going to be paying more. So it's important to ask the duration. Now, you also want to talk about the start information. Very important you understand what the time is for each start. So for an example, let's say you had a triathlon and you had maybe 5 or 6 waves, and they were broken down by skill set, maybe even gender, or possibly by distance. Well, you have to ask, when are each of these waves going to go and what are the start times? Most of the time when there's a 5 and 10K race, it's not uncommon to see the race director start the 5K race after the 10K. In other words, they might say, okay, the 10K is going to go at 8 o'clock and the 5K is going to go at 8:15 or 8:20. Why would they do that? Well, it's because they want to have maximum people coming across their finish line at about the same time to make the race more exciting. So sometimes you'll see that. Conversely, sometimes they'll start the 5K at 8 o'clock and they'll wait to start the 10K until maybe 8:30. It depends a lot on the number of participants. So asking what times the races will start is very important. Asking if there are waves, again, very important. And finally, the last thing you want to ask for the start information is whether or not they're going to want gun or chip time. If it's a gun-timed race, you won't need a timing system at the starting line. You'll simply capture the start time in the Jaguar software using the Set Start Times option. If it's a chip time start, then you're going to be setting up a system at that start location. It's also important to ask the race director if they want both gun and chip times delivered to the participants. Sometimes they'll use chip time and say, we're not going to demonstrate or show that. We're not going to provide it to the participants until perhaps the next day. It might be like noon the next day we'll publish chip results. We just want gun results the day of the race. So you need to be sure to ask that information. Now, to make it even more interesting, what happens if the race is an out and back course? For those of you who may not know what that means, it means that they're going to start at the location, go out perhaps and run, let's say it was a 10K race. They're going to go run 3.1 miles. They're going to turn around. Maybe there's a cone out there or there's a traffic circle. Whatever it is, they're going to turn around and they're going to come back to the finish line, which is effectively the same location as the start line. So the one timing system that's on the road could be used for both start and finish. We call that an out and back course. It's critical that you ask if it's an out and back, and even more important, you want to make sure if they say yes, it's an out and back, make sure the start and finish are actually at the same location. We've timed races where the race director says it's an out and back. You get there race morning and they say, oh, well, yeah, it's out and back, but the finish is 300 yards away. So you want to make sure if they say out and back to ask them, is it exactly the same location? And that'll help you be prepared. Now let's talk about some of the other types of races you may run into. A good example would be something like a mountain bike race, which is oftentimes a lap event. If it's an enduro, it might be something like a 5 or 6 hour race where the participants may ride we'll make it up, a 7K or 8K distant course, and they're going to do as many laps as they possibly can. So you have to ask if it's a lap event. The other types of lap events that you might see are adventure races. Not unusual to see them do 2 or 3 or 4 laps. And sometimes if a college stadium is being used for something like a marathon or a half marathon or even a 10K, they'll run on the track and they'll do a number of laps. So it's important that you ask if it's a lap event, and you'll typically know that by the way the race organizer is talking to you, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Now, one other thing you have to think about, if it's going to be an out and back course, for example, or it's going to be a lap event, we have to ask what the minimum split times could be. And what that simply means is, let's say that they're going to do an out and back course. We want to ask the race director, how long should it take for the fastest runner to complete that event? Now, you're probably already thinking, well, that should be about maybe 28 to 29 minutes, but we'll still ask the race director that and say, what's the minimum amount of time it takes? If it's a lap event, it's critical that we ask, what's the minimum time for somebody to complete a lap? And the reason for that is in Jaguar, we have our minimum split time. We're going to want to set that properly so that if somebody cuts the course or comes back early, they're not getting an additional lap. Okay, now that we understand the various categories and races we have, let's gather some more information from the RD about the participants. So the types of things you're going to want to ask are, how many people do you expect in the event? One of the things I like to do is ask, when is the registration online cutoff? In other words, let's say the website says, well, you can register up to 3 days before the event. I'm going to ask the RD, that's the race director, to confirm that online cutoff date for us so we know. If they're using one-stop race for their event, we have the added advantage that we can go in and look at that. We can see what the cutoff is, and then we can actually download the data directly into Jaguar. However, if they're using Active or one of the other services, or maybe they have their own website, we want to ask that race director, what's the timeline for us getting the first database? Now, a trick that'll really help you get ready for the event is to ask for that first database 3 to 4 weeks in advance of the event. And the reason for that is it will oftentimes reveal a little bit of information about perhaps how many participants. It'll also tell you sometimes if the race director has added a category that you don't know about. And I've had that happen. Somebody once added a children's fun run to the event. I had no idea. They had not communicated that to us. It was a last-minute decision they made. And sure enough, the registration information that was 3 to 4 weeks in advance of the event had children registered for a fun run. So we like to get that information a good 3 to 4 weeks in advance. The next thing we'll ask is, how often will we get updates to that data? Typically, I like to see those updates come in about every week leading up to the event. And then we'll ask, when's the final database going to be provided to us? That is probably one of the most critical things that you need to communicate to the race director. Oftentimes, they'll just assume that they can hand it to you, 20, 30 minutes before the start of the race, and that's just not the case. You have to tell the race director, we need that final database at least 24 hours before the event. Personally, I like to have 2 to 3 days, but on a big race, sometimes that's not possible. So you do want to nail down when the final database will be provided. You also want to communicate and ask how are changes going to be handled after registration closes. Oftentimes, what will happen is the race director or their staff will make the changes in their spreadsheet, and they forget that the timer needs that information as well. Let's say somebody wants to move from the 10K to maybe the half marathon. They call the race office, they talk to somebody there on the staff and say, I want to change my race, and they're allowed to do so. That staff member is not thinking about the trickle-down damage, so to speak, that's going to happen because they don't think about the timing system and the fact that you need that information. So it's critical that you communicate to the race director and say, how are changes going to be sent to us, and how do we make sure we've gotten them so that we can correctly score the event? Also, you have to think about race day. So you want to ask the race director, are you going to allow race day registrations? If they say no, you also want to ask, are you going to allow changes on race day? That's a tough one because race directors will tell you, no, we're not going to allow it. And then, in fact, they'll do that. So you have to really be on top of them and make sure they understand that if they're going to do race day changes, there's got to be a process around that and give you plenty of time to still time and score the event. You also want to ask if they're having an expo. If they're having an expo, it's very likely they're going to allow registrations or changes at that expo. So when it comes to participants, what do we want to do? We want to ask how many there are going to be and get an estimate. That's very important because that determines how many timing systems you may need. A lot of times a race director will say, well, we're only expecting 300 or 400, and in fact they might have 700 or 800. So you always want to err on the side of caution by having more staff and maybe a little more equipment than you thought you would need. Okay, after you've communicated that to them, you need the participant information. You want to make sure there's a process in place for changes, when you're going to get that final database, how you're going to deal with additions or changes or deletions, how you're going to deal with race day registration issues, and if there's an expo, how that's going to be managed as well. In addition to the information on the participants, we need to ask about age groupings. The race director will most likely want to hand out age group awards or perhaps mail them. So you've got to talk to that race organizer and make sure you understand or have them send to you what their age group breakdowns will be. One tip here for you, if they are allowing people to register but not have to provide their age, you're going to want to create an age group to deal with those people. We do an age group 99 here, which just simply means if we get a spreadsheet and we don't have an age, we give them an age of 99, and we have an age group setting that corresponds to that. It means they won't win an age group award, and that's how it should be. So you want to make sure to get the age groups from the RD. Finally, awards and results. You have to make sure to ask what they're going to want in terms of awards, when they're going to want the data, the results that drive those awards. How are you going to provide that to them? It's kind of an interesting story. I was at a race once where the race director had said, we'll send somebody over to get the information to hand out the awards, and in fact they never did. They actually got on the PA system in the stadium and said, we're looking for somebody from the timing company to give us those blasted results. And it turned out that they had in fact not sent somebody over to get them, and we didn't know they were ready to do the awards. So communication is key, as you can tell. It's important to ask, when are you going to do the awards? When do you need the results? How do you want to review that data? And make sure that you get it to them. One last tip when it comes to awards and results. If the race starts at, let's say, 9 o'clock, and they expect that people will be in by, say, 9:30, and they want to do the awards at 10, push them back a half hour if you get the chance. Say to the race director, is there any chance you could maybe do those awards at, I don't know, half hour later? And the reason for that is if there's something wrong with the data, and that can happen, you want to have time to make corrections before the awards and results are handed out. When you're talking to them about the awards and results, here's a couple of really advanced tips that'll help you a lot on race day. Ask the race director if somebody can win an award in multiple categories or age groupings. For example, let's use one for real. Let's say we have somebody who's 42 years old and they've just won the 5K race. That's probably going to be our overall winner who's going to get an award. That makes sense. Well, are we also going to allow them to win their age group, which might be, say, 40 to 45? Since that person's over the age of 40 and most masters are set at 40, we want to find out, is that person also going to be allowed to win the masters category? We call that multi or double dipping sometimes. Most races don't allow it, and that's typically how we like to see it, because other people who have run the race get a little upset if somebody gets to walk away with all the awards. So it's important that you ask and make sure you know how the race director wants it done. I think you'll find in most cases they'll say, nope, single award, but it is possible they may want to give multiple awards to one individual. Okay, so we've collected all this data, we've got our awards and results, we've handed maybe the RD, the age group listings, but the big question is, where do we want to post all these results we've got? Sometimes a race director will say, well, can you print them out and put them up on the side of a trailer, maybe at a gazebo, but you want to ask. It's very important to say, do you want the results posted at the race site? If you're using our kiosks or you're using announcer displays, you may want to ask about that. Also, you want to ask if they want those results online. Sometimes the bigger races will do it themselves, but sometimes they'll ask you to do it. Most small races aren't set up to do it themselves, and so you want to ask, do you have a website, and what is your expectation in terms of getting the results posted to that website? Do you want to do it? Do you want us to do it? And if you want us to do it, where do you want it posted? Very important that you gather that information as well. Okay, we've gathered a lot of information about this race that we're going to be timing. A few last questions and things you want to communicate to the race director. First of all, is that race going to have an expo where you might be doing chip check? If you're doing chip check, you want to know that. Is it going to be race day? Is it going to be the expo? And if you're doing chip check, you're going to need to have a system at that location to verify and confirm that the chips are programmed and that the right name is associated with that chip number. You also want to ask about the bib numbers, and are they going to assign the number, or are you going to assign it? Probably the majority of the time, the race directors don't care about the assignment of the bib numbers. They're going to let you do that, and Jaguar will automatically do that when you import data. It'll just start at bib 1. However, if you wanted to, you could go into Excel and you could actually set the bib number in the spreadsheet before you import it into Jaguar. So you could use your own bib number range. It has to be within the range of your system, whatever particular Jaguar system you own, but you could set it up yourself. So you want to ask the RD, are you going to assign the bib numbers, or would you like us to do it for you? You want to talk about transfer policy. Is somebody allowed to transfer from one race to another? And if they, in fact, transferred during the race, what's that mean? It means they signed up for the 10K, but they ran the 5K. And you know that because their time was obviously a lot less than it should have been. Is that person disqualified? You might want to set up a division called DQ, and since there's no transfers permitted, we might disqualify them. So you want to ask what the transfer policy is. And then you want to ask what the policy is with regard to disputes or any kind of issues that come up. It's not unusual. Even if you have a perfectly timed race, people will come up to you and say, I don't believe my time is right. I'm pretty sure I beat somebody else in the race. I have never, in the history of our company, seen Jaguar, get it wrong by 3 minutes. So we've had people come up to us and say, I'm sure my time is off by 3 minutes. I'm pretty sure I finished in front of somebody. Well, when we go to look at the video, and we always videotape our finish lines, we always find that we were right. And generally what happens is a person says, oh, yeah, you were right. I actually wasn't that strong today. So how do you deal with disputes or issues that come up? Talk to the race director about that. Make sure you understand their policy, because you're going to be involved in that process. And if you just listen carefully, I just gave you a great tip. Buy yourself an inexpensive, good quality video camera and place that at the finish line and use that as your backup, because when issues do arise, you want to have a way to find out for sure if you're right. And that's one of the best ways possible. Now we've gathered a lot of information from the race director, and there's one last thing we really want to talk about. As you've talked to the race director, you've probably gathered what their expectations are for the event. Is this somebody who's cool-headed, understands that you may miss a few chip reads, or is this somebody who has an extremely high set of expectations for your performance? And that's important to understand because it leads to redundancy. If you have more than one Jaguar system, let's say for example you own 2 bronze systems, you should always have that bronze system, assuming it's available, at a backup position 30 to 40 feet behind your finish line. It's always critical to have a backup strategy in place. If you don't happen to own a second system, or one's not available, you could always run Jaguar or Jaguar Remote on a laptop 30 feet behind the finish line, and you could use that to make sure that you're typing in bib numbers, certainly of the first few hundred people who have finished the event. That's going to make sure that you have the data that you need to generate things like age group results and to cover the awards. So redundancy is crucial, and it's important that you understand what the expectation is of the race director. Some are fairly mild-mannered, some are rather tense, and so you want to make sure to understand that. Now that we've gathered all of this information that we've talked about in this module, what are we going to do with it? Well, let's take a quick look at Jaguar and you'll see. We're going to go over to our race info screen here, and we're going to select our division settings. Remember, we talked about how many races are going on today, or perhaps categories. Well, now that we have that information, we can enter that right here into our division screen. As you can see, I've got 5K and 10K already set up. And the good news is this information has been covered extensively in another module, so we've already taught you how to set up the divisions. Now that you know how to set up divisions, you can understand why we're asking the race director these questions. It's what we're using to basically fill in this screen. We're going to do the exact same thing with our age group settings. Remember, we have all kinds of options there, and so now we can set those up properly because we understand what the race director wants from us. So we'll go set up our age groups. The next thing we're going to do is we need to get the data into the system. Remember, we got the first set of data about a month before the event, and then about every week we were getting updates. And finally, 24 hours or maybe 48 hours before the event, we got our final spreadsheet. If we're using One Stop Race, we can simply import that data directly. We don't have to have a spreadsheet provided to us. If the registration is being done elsewhere, perhaps at Active or some other company, or maybe they're just using a spreadsheet at the race company themselves, or they have their own website, we can import that data. So we're going to get that into our Jaguar database. Once we've done that, the last thing we want to think about are filters. Remember, if it's a 5K, 10K, perhaps going on the same day, we don't want to read chips at the inopportune time. So, for example, if the 5K is starting again at maybe 8 o'clock and the 10K, I don't know, it's starting at 8:30, we don't want those 10K people who are standing around to be read. So we can come in here and we can set up filters and we can make sure that we're only reading the chips we want to. So, to summarize, what have we done in this module? We've done a lot of communication, haven't we? We've talked to the race director and said, we need to understand what kind of races you're having, the categories. Is it a certified course? How long will the race last? How many people are you expecting at this event? What are your start times going to be? Are you using waves? Do you want gun time at the start? Do you want chip time? Do you want both on your reports? We've asked about the participants themselves. We've asked, when will we get the first database? When will we get our updates? When do we get the final database? How are we going to deal with changes, additions? What's going to be our transfer policy? When do they want their bib numbers delivered to them? And how are we going to assign the numbers? We've got to figure that out. We want to know if there's a chip check. Is it going to be on race day? Is it going to be at the perhaps expo? How are we going to deal with disputes or any kind of issues that come up on race day? Well, then finally we're going to say, how are we going to generate the awards and the results? Are we going to do that live? Are we going to do it at the race? Are we going to post it at the race? Are we going to have kiosks, scrolling screens? Are we going to give it to them so they can post it on their website that night or perhaps the next day? Or are we going to do it? All of this information is crucial and will help you have a really great event. As you've seen in this demonstration and this training module, you really have to pay attention to the details. You've got to talk to the race director, you've got to gather all the facts, and then once you have that, you're all set. You can go configure Jaguar, you can make sure you're going to have a terrific event on that weekend. Thanks for attending this module. We'll see you in the next one.